Sonia Loya, the proud owner of a Judaica store in the quaint town of Ruidoso, New Mexico, was bewildered as a child by some of her grandmother's odd customs. Her grandmother, who was a devout Catholic, happened to pray 3 times a day. She also insisted on having a bedside altar that she always faced toward the east. When she was younger, Sonia remembered her grandmother instructing her to check eggs for blood spots before eating them, and how her final request on her deathbed was that she be buried with her feet facing the east. Strange customs that were not observed by anyone else in her small southwest town in Alpine, Texas, but to us might sound familiar. We've heard stories like this before. We've read about, as Wyatt Orm writes, grandfathers who refused to eat pork and who wore hats to church services on Saturday, or grandmothers who lit candles on Friday nights, and cattle ranchers who would slaughter their flocks at the neck, drain the blood, remove the sciatic nerve, and salt the meat. Unusual practices for those not in the know. After her grandmother passed away, Sonia researched her family genealogy and discovered, to her surprise, but maybe not ours, that some of her ancestors were Sephardic Jews who were forced to convert to Catholicism during the Inquisition. This, in turn, led to her own journey of self-discovery and eventual conversion to Judaism in 2005. Stories like Sonia's, which are becoming more and more common with the popularization of genetic testing, are truly amazing. People all over the world are uncovering their medieval Jewish roots after 500 years of living as Christians or Muslims, far removed from their Jewish ancestry. To me, what these types of stories really affirm are the tremendous power of ritual acts. These crypto-Jews, as people like Sonia's grandmother have been characterized, should have been lost to the annals of history long ago. And while many of them were, some of them weren't. And it wasn't faith or Torah or genetics that anchored them to the past. It was ritual. It was mitzvot. Despite living thousands of miles from the nearest Jewish community, there was some force at play that kept them, however loosely, a part of the tribe. And when I read stories like Sonia Loya's, I can't help but wonder, what mitzvot my great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren will observe that connects them back to me? Mitzvot, these remarkably durable generational links, are, at their core, fundamental attempts to reflect God's will in the world. But they are also, more than most other aspects of Jewish life, keystones of Jewish continuity whose importance as markers of Jewish identity cannot be understated. As we see through stories like that of Sonia's grandmother, mitzvot can act like time machines that transport us through time and space spanning millennia and touching all corners of the earth. As 21st century Jews living in America, there is very little we share in common with the Jews of 3rd century Babylonia. We dress differently, we speak differently, we think differently, we behave differently, and we even relate to religion differently. But if Rav Huna, the famous Talmudic sage, arrived in New Rochelle on the 15th of Tishrei and saw us eating in our sukkah, or watched as we lit Shabbat candles on Friday night, or heard us recite the blessings as we gathered to pray each morning, he might see pieces of his own life reflected back to him. He might suddenly, miraculously, find himself at home again. We Jews are a diverse people, but whether we live in North Africa, Spain, Israel, China, or Canada, we can understand one another through our sacred ritual practices. And the question this raises, and which I ask all of us to consider this year, is if we are sincerely striving to grow in our religious practices, the one that thickens our connection to other Jews past, present, and future, or if we have simply become religiously complacent. Do we actively try to incorporate more mitzvot into our daily lives? Or are we content with our commitments to Jewish practice as they stand today? Today of all days, the words Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'nashuva chadesh yamenu kikedem, return us to you, God, renew our days like the days of old, carry new meaning. As Sonia Loya learned, mitzvot are the means by which we return. They are portals that connect us to God and to each other. If there's any lesson we can derive from Yom Kippur, it's the idea that living a Jewish life ought to be an evolving process, a never-ending journey of self-refinement and growth that at its best can enrich our lives and strengthen our identity as Jews. Because ultimately, a religious tradition that demands nothing or expects no religious development over time is destined to fade and go the way of all the earth. I first understood the importance of asking this question in 2012 when Lisa and I were living in Israel for the year. We decided to spend Hanukkah in Prague, and we budgeted one day of our trip for a tour of the Jewish quarter where we visited all of the community synagogues, some of which dated back to the 13th century. In one of them, there was a siddur from the 17th century enclosed in a glass case in the synagogue's museum. It was open to Lecha Dodi. We each took a moment to examine the intricate designs on the margins of its pages before moving on with the rest of the tour. And when we had a chance to reflect on it later, neither of us were particularly touched by the siddur itself. We had seen beautiful prayer books like this before. What overwhelmed us was the sense of connection we both felt to our peoplehood. We saw this liturgical book from a place and time so different from our own, yet still recognized the words on its pages. They were the same words that we sing dutifully and soulfully every Friday night. It was powerful to imagine that had we been in shul that day all those years ago, as the Jews of Prague sang its chorus loudly, we would be able to sing it alongside them. And we both acknowledged how sad it would be to lose that link to the past. In one Devar Torah, Dr. Benjamin Summer, a Bible scholar at JTS, articulates what he sees as the Torah's vision for why mitzvot matter. In Parshat Acharei Mot Kedoshim, some of which we read this afternoon, the Torah connects Israel's holiness alongside demands for Israel's observance of the mitzvot. The consistent message, he says, is not that the nation of Israel is automatically holy, as if holiness were in some special Jewish gene each of us received when we were conceived. Rather, holiness is something the Torah requires us to foster in our communities and in ourselves. There is nothing special about being Jewish, he says, but there is something sacred in observing the Torah. In other words, holiness is something we acquire by making conscious decisions about how we choose to live our lives. Our choices can either make us a distinct community with common practices and common ways of speaking about ourselves, or they can make us like everybody else. Without mitzvot, we lose the essence of what makes Jews kadosh, brothers and sisters eternally linked through a sacred mission and sense of purpose. This is precisely the beauty of our tradition, and what enables those born into other faiths to claim equal ownership over our shared tradition. Our practices bind us, no matter who we are or what circumstances we were born into. As Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove writes, performing a mitzvah is a proud transformation of the universal self into a Jewish self. We manifest our particular identity through our decisions of what to eat, how to structure our time, and how to present ourselves to the world. Why should we observe mitzvot? Because doing so is the means by which we express pride in who we are and in where we came from, and our hope that those who come after us will feel and do the same. There is no greater act of Jewish self-assertion, empowerment, and hope, he says, than the performance of a mitzvah. To do a mitzvah is to take agency over our spiritual lives. This is a ubiquitous idea in Judaism, whether we are conscious of it on a daily basis or not. Even the artificial internal divides we've created over the last 150 years to distinguish ourselves from one another revolve around our commitment to mitzvot. When we call ourselves Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Renewal, Reconstructionist, what does that even imply? For most of us, these labels are just code words for how we think about rituals. Are they commandments from God? Are they divinely inspired human constructs? Or are they folkways that from a bygone age that may or may not be relevant today? And while these divides were once important markers of ideological difference, perhaps they've led us astray. What would it look like if rather than labeling ourselves by the beliefs we hold in contrast to one another, we thought of ourselves instead as partners in a sacred journey of religious self-discovery, striving, and growth? Is it possible that shift in thinking might also change our relationship to Judaism and to other Jews? I believe it would, and for the better. Mitzvot can and should unite us. I imagine that some of us might find what I'm asking today challenging, especially if we identify strongly as Jews but are not halachically observant. We may experience a connection to our Jewish selves most strongly through watching Seinfeld, or reading about Jewish history, or even by eating Jewish foods. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I also enjoy those things. And at the same time, it is necessary to acknowledge the complications of Jewish continuity that arise when the vast majority of American Jews say that remembering the Holocaust is by far more essential to their Judaism than observing Shabbat. Our cultural loves of Judaism don't create the same thickness in experience or lasting impact as ritual acts. A love of bagels, as delicious as they might be, wouldn't have helped Sonia Loya rediscover her Jewish roots. Now, I want to make it clear, I am not judging anyone for the decisions they make around what mitzvot they do or do not observe. I am not the mitzvah police. I am not checking tzitzit or keeping attendance of everyone who comes to shul. On the contrary, as a rabbi, I know better than most how commitments to certain religious practices ebb and flow with time. Sometimes when Avi or Noam keep me up late at night, or if the Phillies go into extra innings, all I want to do the next day is sleep in. The thought of waking up early, going to minyan, and putting on tefillin is exhausting. And while I strive to fulfill that commandment daily, I don't always get there. But I still strive. And all I ask is that you consider joining me in that journey. As Jews in America, we find ourselves living through a unique moment in history. We are no longer subjugated by those in positions of power over us as we once were. And much of what used to bind us together no longer does, and no longer exists in the ways it once did. That's not to say that it can't or won't happen again, but for now, thank God, Baruch Hashem, we enjoy freedoms in this country that are unprecedented in our history. But an unfortunate byproduct of this success is a decline of engagement in religious life. This is a challenge of American Jews that Chabad, in particular, understands well. Their success as an organization has largely been predicated on empowering Jews to grow in their Judaism through mitzvot. They don't get bogged down in theology or history or philosophy. They just want Jews to reestablish their connection to Judaism one ritual act at a time. They uphold Ben Azai's dictum to be as zealous in performing a light mitzvah as we are in a more stringent mitzvah, since mitzvah goreret mitzvah. One mitzvah leads to another. What an incredible way to live out one's Judaism. No judgment, just pure, unadulterated love for mitzvot. Here is a lulav. Come and shake it. And while we might not be Chabad for a myriad reasons, maybe what we can learn from them is that mitzvot extend beyond just continuity and identity. They don't merely tether us to the past, but they can also elevate the present. We see this in our own way every time we go to a Jewish wedding. The simcha, the joy a couple feels when they choose to spend their lives together can be enriched through blessings and songs that are imparted to them underneath their wedding canopy. Getting married by a justice of the peace might feel beautiful and lovely in many ways, but it isn't the same as circling our beloved beneath a symbol of God's sheltering presence. It doesn't imbue the same feeling as huddling under a grandparent's talit, swaddled by those who came before us. Rituals take everyday moments and transform them into sacred acts that can withstand the test of time. A painful lesson we learned over the past 6 months and continue to learn through today is the need to empower each other to practice Judaism on our own. Even those of us who came to Bethel regularly, Shabbat after Shabbat, were scrambling for spiritual connection when our building closed in March. This highlighted all the ways, positively, that our community can be a tremendous source of comfort. But it also exposed the ways we failed to create the kind of community we dream of becoming. We held each other through the pandemic in extraordinary ways. We created a slew of online programs. We formed call trees to connect regularly and ward off the effects of isolation. We created spaces to increase Torah learning, and we cultivated rich educational opportunities for our children. But it was clear that something was still missing, especially given our inability to gather on Saturday mornings. That something was ritual. The ritual of coming to shul, the ritual of eating kiddush together, the ritual of putting on our talit, and the ritual of singing our favorite Shabbat melodies. And even though we can now gather in the sanctuary in limited numbers or watch the service via live stream, many of us continue to feel that loss in our lives. This is why our Shabbat at Home initiative is so important. We understand that discovering new ways of living Jewishly isn't easy, and we want to provide anyone who wants to have a meaningful Shabbat experience with the tools to do so. No one in our community who wants to take on a new mitzvah will be alone. No one will have to figure out how to deepen their ritual practice by themselves. We are here to support you in your journeys of Jewish striving and growth. Hashivenu Hashem Elecha V'Nashuva. Building or not, pandemic or not, together we can elevate our lives through the ritual acts that connect us back to God and to the generations of Jews that came before us, and God willing, will live long after we are gone. Who knows? Maybe one day, our great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren will open up our Siddur and find it so meaningful that they're living out their Jewish lives through the same ritual acts that we did. Just another link in the Jewish chain. Gemar Chatima Tova.